Well, hello and a very warm welcome to the Flourishing Together podcast, where we reflect on shared journeys of hope and stewardship in education. I'm Ryan Parker, the RE and Christian Ethos Advisor of the Diocese of St Albans, and we're continuing our travels today to think about courageous advocacy. Walking with me today is Caz Weir. Good morning, Caz. Hello.
Good morning, Ryan. It's lovely to be with you.
Oh, I'm so excited that you're able to join us. Would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So my background is in secondary RE teaching, and I did that for about 10 years before moving into an advisory role. I currently work for the Dioceses of Durham and Newcastle. We've got a joint education team, and I support RE and collective worship and other areas of Christian distinctiveness there. Alongside that role, I was working for Christian Aid, running the Global Neighbours program for primary schools. So it's an accreditation program in global citizenship education. And then most recently, I've just finished with Christian Aid a year ago, and I'm back in the classroom part-time alongside my diocesan role.
Oh, thank you so much, Caz. I'm really delighted you're able to join us, because I know this is an area that you're really passionate about, and you've done lots of deep thinking and supporting schools in this area. Now, the concept of courageous advocacy, I've noticed, is one which has emerged quite prominently in the last few years within church school education. And it's something indeed that many schools see as really core to who they are as school communities and also what they seek to do. That said, it's been identified this is an area that's not yet accurately understood across the church school sector. So I'd love to know, first of all, from your perspective, what is courageous advocacy?
So it was a new concept, wasn't it, that came in with the 2018 SIAM schedule. And I think for some that it's a bit of a mystery. But what I'd like to do today really is just to kind of demystify it. In terms of a working definition that I use for courageous advocacy, I like to think about what is advocacy. To be an advocate, you speak on behalf of someone else. And to be an advocate requires courage. And so courageous advocacy for me is the act of speaking out against an issue of injustice on behalf of those often whose voice is not heard. And for children, young people, and for us grown-ups, speaking out at whatever level this takes place requires courage, and sometimes a great deal of courage. So being a courageous advocate for change is somebody who is informed and becomes informed about an issue, finds out as much as they can about it, and thinks about how they can use their voice and perhaps amplify their voice using those around them and gathering their agency alongside them, as well as thinking about who holds the power, who holds the decision-making power, and involving those people in that work.
Caz, that's brilliant. Thank you. I'd love to know what's got you so interested in this area of education.
For me, it was the kind of sweet spot in my learning journey myself as a teacher. So as a secondary RE teacher, we did lots of work on ethics, and I used to teach a module on wealth and poverty, and that was part of the old GCSE specs as well. And as part of that, it was something that I personally was interested in, but then became more and more engaged with as I worked with children and young people who just felt so strongly about it. As we know, children and young people have just got such a sense of justice. And I think sometimes as adults, we become cynical to that. We become thinking, well, I'm only one voice, what difference can I make? But harnessing those teenagers in my classroom kind of reminded me, actually, this is something that I feel really passionate about, and this is something that I want to act on. And then when I moved to Christian Aid, that was like my dream job, in the sense of it brought together my interest in education and my passion for education, my passion for children and young people, and my passion for social justice and to make a change. And so for me, that work running the Global Neighbours scheme and developing that really helped me to develop my own thinking about appropriate approaches to aid, for example, about how we can actually genuinely make a difference. How can we get to these root causes rather than just trying to soothe symptoms? And that was something that I, over my time, became more and more problematic for me in terms of things that I had done in my own practice previously. And I really wanted to reflect more deeply on I suppose, a better way, and a way of thinking more critically, actually, about that, both with colleagues and with children and young people.
Yeah, absolutely love that. And I think there's so much richness within this term and this pursuit of flourishing, within the whole of society. And also those questions about what do we feel the purpose of education is? We talk a lot about heads in schools and classrooms in terms of knowledge. But I think there's so much wealth in thinking, well, yes, it is, of course it is, but it's also hearts and it's also hands. How can we help our children and young people, both today and in the future, meet the world with criticality sometimes, but also compassion, and in a way which you alluded to in your definition of advocacy, having the confidence to be agents and to actually say, my voice matters, I can really do something here. I'd love to know next then, this is something that lots of church schools are thinking about quite deeply, particularly how it relates to their vision. But I'd love to know, from your perspective, why do you think it's so important to think about courageous advocacy, I suppose, from a church school perspective?
That's a great question. I think for me, as church schools, for us, the Christian gospel is at the heart of what we do. And for me, the Christian gospel is about a message of hope, and it's a hope for all people and for all situations. And God's heart for hope and for justice and his vision of human flourishing runs all the way through Scripture. And we can see that justice thread that runs throughout the biblical narrative. And for us as church schools based in this biblical narrative, then being able to see right from the beginning God's vision for human flourishing, this idea of God's care for the weak and vulnerable. So back in the Old Testament laws, that idea of making sure that the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the foreigner should not be mistreated, but should be cared for. And the call of God's prophets to speak out against injustice, that God longs for this world where justice rolls like a river. And that thread then continues into the New Testament as Jesus seeks to bring in God's kingdom, to welcome the outsider, to stand with the marginalized, to welcome those who others left out and maybe felt like outcasts. And Jesus' heart for courageous advocacy for me is unmistakable. And as church schools, people who seek to live in the light of this narrative, then courageous advocacy is something that is so important for us to do. And in terms of our outworking of our Christian visions in our own specific contexts, then courageous advocacy should be a natural outflow of that theologically rooted Christian vision that each of us will have in our context based on the children and young people we've got and the communities that we have around us.
Oh, thank you, Caz. I think you've really captured so much there about courageous advocacy and how it's rooted biblically, but not least when schools are really thinking about more intentionally what it means to have a theologically rooted Christian vision. And I've been really struck by the ways that schools have really shown a heart for the earth and a heart for others through being courageous advocates. And they've really made such a stand to act against injustices which they see in the world. And I know that doesn't just happen. It requires intentionality from a school, opportunity, and also lots and lots of encouragement. And it's so much better when a school phrases that or frames that thinking as emerging from their Christian vision. Now, Caz, I know many schools will be at the start of their journey thinking about courageous advocacy. And I wonder, for schools who are really wanting to support and champion pupils in their courageous advocacy, what advice would you like to share with colleagues?
What I would say is that this requires, for most schools, I would say, a complete culture change as to how you think about the action that you take when you're looking outwards. Schools across the country and across the world have always been places where people try to be altruistic, where people try to look outwards, that the work of charities is often central to what schools do, and charity fundraising is often part of the school calendar, and all of those things. And of course, charities need fundraising, charities need money to be able to do the work that they do. But what I would want people to think about really deeply is the fact that courageous advocacy seeks to move beyond fundraising. So moving beyond charity towards justice and ultimately equity. And that requires a real change in thinking that isn't going to happen overnight, and that actually requires people to go on a journey, and will require your adults in your school to go on a journey. Because for most of us, if you're anything like me, that I didn't have any sort of global citizenship education training as part of my training to become a teacher. I didn't have anyone ever sit down and talk with me about teaching children about how to tackle the issues in the world. And actually, for many of us, often because of the ways that charities work, perhaps campaigns like Band-Aid and Live Aid and all of those sorts of things have led us to the conclusion that in order to solve a problem, we need to raise money. And whilst fundraising is important, courageous advocacy seeks to move beyond that, because fundraising actually is giving a simple solution to a problem that is much more complex. Because as we know, fundraising on its own is unlikely to solve the underlying injustices of whatever the issue is. Those structural problems that keep people poor, those structural problems that mean that things are unfair, are not going to be solved by fundraising. And so fundraising will soothe the symptoms, but courageous advocacy as an idea is about helping children, young people, and our grown-ups to think about, actually, what do we need to do in order to tackle the injustice? Because ultimately all charities, they want to do themselves out of a job. They want that injustice to be dealt with and tackled so that their work is no longer needed. While it's great to give to food banks, wouldn't it be even better to have a world where food banks are not needed? And so courageous advocacy is that trying to take children and young people and our grown-ups on that journey. And so for schools wanting to do that, I would say that's step number one. So work together with your staff. Think together about what is your current practice? What fundraising perhaps do you do? What charity work do you do? What social action, if any, do you do? And think about why you do it, and whether unintentionally perhaps stereotypes are being being reinforced. And by that, what I mean is that unintentionally children are leaving with the idea that if they raise money, so if, for example, they buy a red nose at Comic Relief, that is going to solve world poverty. Or if they begin to buy a fair trade chocolate bars, that is going to deal with the injustices in the world. Neither of those things are wrong things to do. And of course, I'm a great advocate of fair trade. But helping children actually to think critically through, what can we do to get to the underlying problem here? What can we do to tackle these underlying problems? And that is where I would suggest you start. And perhaps you're hoping for a kind of a more practical step, but actually it's that underlying thinking that needs to happen first. And taking a step back, looking at your curriculum, looking at your collective worship program, looking at perhaps the charitable work that you do, and thinking through really seriously about what you are doing to ensure that you're helping children to see that simple solutions are not going to solve complex problems, and that perhaps some of the charitable work that we do sometimes can reinforce this idea of a donor-beneficiary relationship, rather than thinking about mutually beneficial partnerships of working together, sharing our agency, using our power together with, rather than seeing ourselves as powerful and others as powerless.
Amazing, Caz. There's so much there to really reflect upon and think deeply upon. So thank you so much for sharing it so clearly as well. I was struck as you were talking there about there's a theologian who I've drawn on quite a lot, kind of personally, but also professionally, and that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And a quote that came to mind was this one here, where he says, "We're not to simply bandage the wounds of victims beneath the wheels of injustice. We are to drive a spoke into the wheel itself." And I know for me, that's something which has helped me in part to really get my head around what courageous advocacy is. You know, as you said, it's that move from charity to a real heart desire for justice. And I'd love to ask a final question then. Many schools will want to then continue thinking about this and drawing on this podcast, so thank you, Caz. But is there any other advice or wisdom or signpost that you would like to perhaps give to colleagues as they start on their journey and continue, or perhaps indeed continue their journey of courageous advocacy in their own context?
Oh, so much advice. We could have a whole other podcast on that, and things to think about and places to look. You know, in terms of really practical things, a scheme like Global Neighbours, I couldn't obviously not promote that. So Global Neighbours is a global citizenship programme. It's an accreditation scheme, but it provides a framework of thinking about areas of school life. So your vision and your leadership, your collective worship and spiritual development, your curriculum, and then pupil participation. And what it really encourages people to do is to think through the curriculum you've already got. This is not about doing an extra thing. This is about adding value to what you're already doing and thinking differently about the curriculum that you have. So I would really encourage people to use a tool like that and to have a look through their curriculum, have a look through their collective worship program, and think about where are you actually providing opportunities for courageous advocacy to take place. Because sometimes you have those wonderful moments where the children just lead something out of nowhere. But in general, these opportunities need to be planned in. Space needs to be created for them. And this way of thinking needs to be taught. So helping children to think about, okay, how can I identify a problem? How can I investigate it? What might be done about it? Helping children to think through a whole range of responses, which then helps you to move beyond fundraising, because fundraising might be one response, but what might other responses be? Who could you write to? Could you set up a campaign? What could you put online? What action might you be able to take? Who might you be able to draw on in your local community? Could it be that you, for a school thing, that you go to your governors? Could it be that the children write to a local business? Could it be that they involve their local councillors? Could it be that they write to their MP? Helping children, and within that, obviously, then they're doing lots of rich learning about democratic processes and about how the world works and about power, ultimately, because we want children and young people not to become disheartened. We want them to become lifelong campaigners, lifelong courageous advocates for change. So I would say, have a look at a scheme like Global Neighbours. Have a think really about how you can move beyond sort of ad hoc responses. And I think in the schools that I've been working in and with, that's been one of the things that we've thought, actually, we're doing more than we think we are, but it's actually quite ad hoc rather than planned in. And I would think really creatively about how you can use your curriculum, but also don't forget about your collective worship, because collective worship can be an absolutely brilliant vehicle for children and young people to reflect upon important issues in our world and to share their learning and their thinking with others within the school community and beyond, and use that time to think differently. How could you add value to things that you already do? In terms of a really practical example, something like perhaps remembrance. Remembrance is something that will happen, I'm sure, in every school that listens to this. But how could we then use that moment in the calendar to think more deeply in terms of being courageous advocates and in terms of global citizenship? Could we look at the different colours of the poppies, think about that white poppy for peace? Could we then make some pledges for peace and pray for peace? Think about how we could be peacemakers, perhaps looking at the black poppy and thinking about those whose voices have been drowned out and not heard, those whose voices have been whitewashed out of history. How can we think about those people during our remembrance time, and then use that to think more deeply about how we work for equity and justice and include the voices of all people and make sure that our table is big enough for everybody to join in at. So one very simple thing that you will probably do every year, but adding another facet. And then, if you don't get it done in a week, that's okay. Keep going. What about having peace as your theme for a half term and looking at different facets of that, and using something that you're doing already to think critically, to think deeply, and then to use that as your springboard for courageous advocacy for change. So right now, unfortunately, we've got the war in Ukraine, and that's a really practical example of something that, what could your pupils do to stand in solidarity? And lots of pupils in schools, I know around the country, have been saying prayers and putting tweets out right now as we are around the 1 year anniversary and so on. And that in itself is an act of courageous advocacy.
Amazing. Well, can I really thank you, Caz? Thank you so much for so kindly giving up your time to share with us on this podcast your wisdom and your experiences. And there's so much just to take away there, to think about as we start to develop this understanding of what courageous advocacy is, what it could be, and how we can really support those in our communities, really demonstrate in a really visible, practical, meaningful way their heart for the world, the earth, others, etc. So thank you so much, Caz, for joining us.